All right. So I was asked to talk about the dietary guidelines in the USA and in Puerto Rico. And next slide. Yeah, yeah, I'm not able to control the slides from here. Yeah, thank you. And basically, why do we have dietary guidelines? Well, we now know that 6 in 10 adults in the US are living with one or more diet-related chronic diseases. Diet is so important in order to keep us healthy. Next. And so there's a lot of work that goes into the US. Next slide. A lot of work goes into the US dietary guidelines. People from the Departments of Agriculture, the USDA, and Health and Human Services select a committee, and for this current for the current guidelines, existing guidelines, the 2025, there were three main themes. One, diet chronic disease relationships are prevalent, and a focus on a dietary pattern as a whole rather than on individual nutrients, foods, or food groups, and to encourage healthy dietary patterns at every life stage. For the first time, the 2025 include recommendations for infants and toddlers. They hadn't had that for a while. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you. So here's the stages that go into the in-depth work that lasts over a full year to develop the dietary guidelines for Americans. First, the topics and supporting scientific questions are identified, which we just mentioned. Then the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee is appointed from experts in the country, and they develop the dietary guidelines, but then the USDA modifies them to the final form, and stage 4 is implementation. Next. And next. So this is what the Dietary Guidelines 2025 outline looks like with the major recommendations. Next slide, please. That follow a healthy diet pattern at every life stage, customize and enjoy nutrient-dense food and beverage choices to reflect personal preferences, cultural traditions, and budgetary considerations. 3, focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods that stay within calorie limits. And 4, limit foods and beverages high in added sugars, saturated fat, and sodium, and limit alcoholic beverages. Next slide. And the theme for this particular guidelines was across the life cycle. And so they've included birth through 23 months because obesity starts early. Iron status is important. Peanut allergies are an issue. Children and adolescents, we also worry about obesity and the beginning of high cholesterol. Pregnant and lactating women is, of course, a critical stage, and older adults, especially older adults, where nutrient inadequacies contribute to all these chronic diseases. Next slide, please. So this is what is new to focus on. For the first 6 months of life, the main recommendations are to exclusively feed infants human milk and to continue through the first year of life, to feed iron fortified formula during the first year, and to provide supplemental vitamin D beginning soon after birth, because we're finding so many children deficient in vitamin D. And about 6 months to introduce infants to nutrient-dense complementary foods, which is important. That nutrient density is throughout the guidelines. And to introduce them, this is new as well, potentially allergenic foods along with other complementary foods. It used to be recommended to avoid peanuts, but with new research, they're now suggesting that you introduce peanuts early to prevent peanut allergy, and encourage a variety of foods and focus on foods rich in iron and zinc, particularly for breastfed infants. And from 12 months through older adulthood, the rest of the dietary guidelines apply. Follow a healthy dietary pattern to meet nutrient needs, achieve healthy body weight, and reduce risk of chronic disease. Next slide, please. The second focus is to enjoy nutrient-dense food. Nutrient density is critical because there's so many foods that are high in sugar and fat and low in nutrients that are taking over people's diets. They also are very concerned that our country has different cultural traditions, different ethnic and racial groups that have different diets, and to consider budgetary issues when they're making the guidelines, because some of the healthiest foods, as we know, are expensive. Next slide. So I was asked to talk about not only the dietary guidelines in the USA, but also in Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico is part of the USA. It's a territory of the USA, but they have their own committee. They don't follow the extent of work that the U.S. committee follows, but they follow the U.S. dietary guidelines and adapt them for Puerto Rico. So we have my plate as the symbol of the simplified symbol of what you should eat in the dietary guidelines. And they have mi plato para un Puerto Rico saludable. Frutas, vegetales, legumbres, agua, cereales, lácteos, and alimentos proteicos. They basically follow very closely the U.S. dietary guidelines, but with consideration of their specific foods, which are more tropical fruits, beans, and other legumes, and protein foods are similar. Next slide. So nutrient density, again, that's the highlight of these dietary guidelines. And here's just some examples of how you can improve your nutrient density. Going from sugared cereal to plain, sugared yogurt to plain, butter to vegetable oil, and soft drinks to sparkling water. Those are just some suggestions. Next slide. They focus on limiting foods in the fourth segment, limiting foods and beverages high in added sugars, saturated fat, sodium, and limit alcohol. Currently, 75% are low in fruits and vegetables. 63% exceed the limit for added sugars. 77% exceed the limit for saturated fat, and 90% exceed the chronic disease risk reduction limits for sodium. These are nutrients of concern in the American diet. Next slide, please. So those are nutrients of concern for overconsumption. Nutrients of concern for underconsumption are calcium, potassium, dietary fiber, and vitamin D. It can be possible to get these nutrients from a healthy dietary pattern, but most Americans do not achieve this. Vitamin D is particularly hard to achieve because it's only in a few foods. And so more and more foods are being fortified with vitamin D. Actually, vitamin D fortified milk is our major source. Some people may need to take a vitamin D supplement, particularly in the winter, because we're seeing so much inadequacy. Next slide. The focus is on dietary patterns rather than specific foods, because it's the whole pattern. It's how we eat everything together that really matters. And the primary USDA dietary pattern is called the Healthy US Style Dietary Pattern. It's measured by the Healthy Eating Index, and it gives a framework based on foods typically concerned, but focusing on nutrient-dense forms. Other variations that are recommended by the dietary guidelines are the Healthy Mediterranean Dietary Pattern. And because we know so many people are adopting a vegetarian lifestyle, we also have a Healthy Vegetarian Dietary Pattern. Next slide. So we measure adherence to the dietary guidelines by something called the Healthy Eating Index, which has a set of foods that should be higher and foods that should be, or nutrients that should be lower, and the total score is 100. But here you can see the those that adhere to the dietary guideline are only about 50% of the population across all age groups, particularly in the adolescents and young children are important targets. Next slide. So here we see what foods are really inadequate. Those that are adequate are in purple. Those that are inadequate are in blue. And you can see that most are inadequate in terms of total vegetables and subsets of vegetables, total fruits. Total grains tends to be adequate, but they tend to be too refined. You see, we have excess refined, and almost very few people meet whole grain recommendations. Dairy recommendations are also a major problem, as are seafood recommendations. The protein foods tend to be from other sources, whereas seafood and nuts, seeds, and soy products remain inadequate. Next slide. Okay, putting the key recommendations into action. These recommendations are used by all of the federal food and feeding programs in the U.S., including the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which used to be called food stamps, where people get a certain low-income people get a certain allotment they can use at the grocery store. The WIC, Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children. And there are several other feeding programs to help as a social safety net. And they all are formed by the dietary guidelines. Next slide. My plate is the simple way. We used to have a pyramid, but we found that next slide, please. We found that the My Plate is a simple visual that works very well. Next slide, please. And again, the kind of symbol of this dietary guidelines set is make every bite count. Start simple with My Plate. And My Plate, of course, has half the plate as fruits and vegetables, and the others split between grains and protein, with a circle that focuses on dairy. Next slide. They've done a lot to help people use the dietary guidelines in the U.S. They continue to improve access to this information. One thing is they now have a My Plate app, so that you can go onto the app and you can see your progress as you enter what you're consuming. You can earn badges and join challenges to try and make it attractive to people to improve their diets. Next slide. They have a My Plate kitchen. They have 1,000 inspired recipes and resources to support building healthy meals. I think a lot of people don't recognize how much is available online at the U.S. Dietary Guidelines site. They have budget-friendly recipes and healthy recipes to make nutrient-dense meals. Next slide. So where are we? Those are the 2025 guidelines. We're currently in the middle of setting up the next set, the 25 to 30 guidelines. And the questions that they have set for these are really to focus more on obesity, because that's such a major problem. Ultra-processed foods have become recognized as an important contributor to poor diets, and so they're also important. The other is health equity, to ensure that the dietary guidelines include ethnic groups and low income in consideration of their needs and practices, and evidence, again, across the lifespan, including all ages. So where are we? We're currently at step 3. They've appointed the advisory committee, and what they're doing now is collecting the evidence to see how they can update their recommendations. They have systematic reviews on many topics, including dietary patterns in health, ultra-processed foods and obesity, specific food groups in health, and they are doing food pattern modeling with the data available to look at nutrient density and dietary patterns, profiles and subgroups, and protein and animal source foods that may be recommended. And finally, they actually do data analysis. They use the US and Haynes data to see where are we, what are we doing, what are people eating at this point in time for 20 to 22. Next slide. That's it. So you have here the link to the dietary guidelines work underway. Above, there was a link to the dietary guidelines made page, and there are so many resources there available for use. So I thank you for your attention late in the day. I know it's been a long day for you all.